Now we're going to discuss a concept called elasticity. This is one of the mathier concepts that we'll discuss in this course, but we can get past the math. It's just some algebra. Really, the important part is that you understand the story, understand the concept. Because it gets a little mathy, some students are thrown for a loop by this concept. But I want to start with this question that will hopefully demonstrate to you that this is not a foreign concept to you. This is something, like a lot of the things that we'll talk about in this course, this is something that you already know about just because you grew up in an economy that's all about markets. So the concept of elasticity, you may not have heard it called that before, you may not have ever calculated it before, but it's something that's not foreign, right? It's something that you already start with a baseline understanding of how this works. So let's think about this question. How do you respond when the price of gasoline rises by 10%? Think about your answer to that question. Right? So many of you probably said, well, you might make a couple of changes. You might try to carpool a little more. But most of us, probably, if the price of gasoline goes up by 10%, our response is not very drastic. You live where you live, and you got to get to work. You got to get to the grocery store. You got to get to the places that you're going. And so even if you look out and see the price of gas at your neighborhood gas station has gone up by 10% today, not much changes about how much you drive your car because you still need to drive your car. But how would this answer change if you're talking about a 10% rise in the price of a Big Mac meal? So some of you really love Big Macs and you eat one every day, and so your answer is very similar to the answer with gasoline. It doesn't change much. I'm still going to eat my Big Mac. But for others of us, we think about, well, if the price of a Big Mac goes up by 10%, I don't really need that Big Mac, right? I can switch and eat a Whopper instead, or I can go buy groceries and eat at home instead. So how I respond to a 10% change in price of gas is very different from how I respond to a 10% change in price of a Big Mac. Now, notice in both of our answers, we did respond by a decrease in our quantity demanded of each of those products, right? And that we should expect because of the law of demand that says when the price rises, our quantity demanded will fall. And that's true of both gasoline and a Big Mac. But the question that elasticity helps us to answer, or the next piece of the story that elasticity brings, is that our quantity demanded falls in each case, but it falls differently depending on what type of good we're talking about. If we're talking about something like gasoline, that's really a necessity. We got to have it to get where we're going because of the lifestyle we lead. Or if we're talking about something like a Big Mac, that it has a lot of substitutes, it may not be a necessity because we can eat a different kind of meal. And then you may also have asked further questions about, well, how long does the price of gas stay up, right? Because we know that gas prices go up and down a good bit regularly, but if the price of gas goes up and stays up for years and years, you may now make changes to your lifestyle. You may move closer to work. You may invest in an electric car or electric scooter or something like that to reduce the amount of gasoline you have to use. So all of these factors are what we're going to discuss further in this unit. These are things that will affect how much our quantity demanded changes when price changes. So let's define elasticity. Elasticity is a measure of the responsiveness of buyers and sellers to changes in price or income. All right, so in the example we just talked about, we were talking about how responsive are you, a buyer, the consumer of gasoline or Big Macs, when the price changes of those goods. All right? We know you will respond. That's the law of demand. The law of demand says people will respond when the price changes. The law of supply says firms will respond when the price changes, right? Elasticity brings a little more to the story. Elasticity helps us answer not only that you will respond, but how much will you respond. Why is it useful? When price or income changes, we can determine how much buyers and sellers change their behavior, not just that they will change their behavior. And this can be super useful, as we'll discuss further in this later on. This can be super useful, particularly if you're a seller. If you want to think about whether you should raise or lower your prices, the answer to that question really is going to depend on the elasticity of demand for your product. If you raise your price just a little bit but lose all of your customers, that's a problem for you, right? You've just lost revenue. But if you can raise your price a little bit and keep all your customers, then you can increase your revenue because now you're getting more for each thing that you're selling. But if you reduce your price, you're getting less for each thing you're selling. But if it brings a ton of new customers into your door, that may be an overall a net positive for you. Even though you're getting less for each thing you sell, you're selling so many more of them because of elasticity of demand, because the consumers really responded to that price change. So this is a really useful concept, particularly for sellers to understand when they're thinking about changing their prices. So we'll talk about several types of elasticity. The first one that we'll really spend most of our time on is price elasticity of demand. So price elasticity of demand is a measure of the responsiveness of quantity demanded to a change in price. It gives us the sensitivity of the relationship between these two variables. And this is really what we talked about with the opening example. How sensitive are you to a change in price? How much will you change your behavior when it comes to purchasing gasoline or purchasing a Big Mac if the price changes of those things? And remember from that example that we talked about a 10% change in price, right? And we're really, with elasticity, we're going to stick to thinking about percent changes and not dollar and cents changes, because with percent changes we can better compare sort of apples to apples. If you think about the numbers that we're talking about here, the price of gas is usually, somewhere between $2 and $3 in our part of the world, at least, per gallon. But the number of people buying gasoline is millions, right? So it wouldn't make sense to compare a change of 1 million people to a change of 2 cents, right? So, because they're just different scales to think about the quantity demanded versus the price of something like gasoline. And so to keep them sort of on the same scale so that we can kind of measure, compare apples to apples, we'll think about a percentage change in each one. So a 10% change in quantity demanded will be a lot more people than a 10% change in the price. But they kind of mean a similar thing, right? It's a similar amount of change relative to where we started. So keep that in mind. We're going to talk about elasticity in terms of percent changes, not absolute changes, right? So back to price elasticity of demand. Price elasticity of demand gives us a measure of the sensitivity of the relationship between price and quantity demanded. And we're going to say that demand is elastic if quantity demanded changes a lot as the result of a price change. Elastic means sensitive or responsive. Think about what you know about the word elastic in the English language, right? A rubber band, we call it elastic. So because why we call it elastic? Because it changes a lot with just a tiny little tug, right? It moves a bunch. It's very movable. It's very sensitive to just a tiny tug. And in terms of elasticity, price elasticity of demand, that price change is the tug, right? and the quantity demanded is the thing that we're going to look and see, does it change a lot or a little, right? So we're going to put a little tug on it, just a little price change, and if that results in a big quantity change, then we're going to say it's elastic. If it results in a lower quantity change, then we're going to say it's inelastic. Right, so if you can change the price a lot and it doesn't affect how many people buy your product, then we're going to say this is an inelastic demand. So the quantity demanded changes really a small amount as a result of a price change. It's very insensitive or unresponsive. This is more like the gasoline example, where it's a necessity, you've got to have it, at least today, right? If we give you more time, you may adjust more, but if you just look out your window and the price of gas has gone up today, it doesn't really change your behavior much because you still got to get to work, right? So we would say that the demand for gasoline is relatively inelastic. So what are some of the things that cause demand to be more or less elastic? So in terms of price elasticity of demand. So one of those things is the existence of substitutes, and this was the Big Mac story, right? How many options do consumers have when the price changes? If you have a lot of other options, like with a Big Mac, you can go buy a Junior Bacon Cheeseburger at Wendy's, or you can go get a Whopper at Burger King instead. If you have a lot of substitutes where you can easily change your behavior, then you will tend to change your behavior more quickly with a price change. So you'll have more elastic demand. If there aren't a lot of substitutes, like gasoline, then you'll have inelastic demand. You got to have it. There's not much you can do else. So you'll keep consuming regardless of what happens to the price. So the example is shown on the slide here. Fruit, a cantaloupe. If the price of a cantaloupe goes up by 10%, you're pretty likely to switch to a different kind of fruit. There's a lot of substitutes available, as opposed to the light bulb here. It represents electricity. Most of us don't even know what we pay per kilowatt hour for electricity. Why? Because you don't look. When you get your bill, you just pay it, because electricity is a necessity. It's something you just have to have anyway, and so you just pay the bill. You don't even think about whether the price went up or down, right? Now, if the price went way up, you might make a few changes, like make sure you don't stand with the refrigerator door open or turn off the lights as you leave the room, things like that. You might try to conserve energy a little bit more if the price does go up. But for the most part, your quantity demanded, though it might change a little, is not going to change much with a price change for something like electricity, where you don't have a lot of substitutes. So another thing that affects price elasticity of demand is the share of your budget that you're spending on the good. So this determines how much the price change affects the consumer. So remember, we're talking about percentage changes. If you've got a big ticket item, like a car, if you find out that there is a 20% sale on all cars at a particular dealership this weekend, if you even remotely were thinking about buying a new car in the next few months, you're going to go do it this weekend, right? That 20% sale on a big ticket item is a lot of money. That's a big deal to you when there's a sale. You've got really elastic demand in terms of that. That little bit of a sale, that 20% sale, is going to have a big effect on your quantity demanded. As opposed to, if you find out that there's a 20% sale on Reese's Cups this weekend, you're probably not going to wake up at 6 a.m. to go bust down the door, right? Because that's an inexpensive item. It's not something that's taking up a bunch of your budget anyway. 20% of the whatever $1 that you were going to spend on them anyway is just 20 cents. It's not enough to have a huge effect on your quantity demanded for this item. So the share of your budget, how expensive the thing is to start with, makes a big difference on how you respond when the price changes by a certain percentage. Third, and we've already touched on this, is it a necessity or is it a luxury? So this affects the options that you face. If it's a luxury, you tend to have more elastic demand. diamond rings. If the price of diamond rings goes up by 20%, you may put off buying one. If it goes down by 20%, now's your chance. You're going to go get it, right? So your demand, your quantity demanded, is pretty responsive to a price change for a luxury good, where for a necessity good, like electricity, or like gasoline, your quantity demanded is pretty inelastic. Your demand is pretty inelastic. You're not going to change your behavior a ton when there's a change in price for these types of goods. Now this one, you may have already thought about this as we were talking about gasoline. So this is a little strange, so follow me here through this explanation. But another thing that affects your price elasticity of demand is whether the market is broadly or narrowly defined. So again, affects the options that consumers face. So what do I mean by that? So if a market is narrowly defined, we say there's elastic demand. So for example, with the gasoline example, if we're talking about one gas station changing their price, then it's a pretty narrowly defined market, right? So if the price of Shell gasoline goes up, okay, you've got substitutes. You'll go to BP, right? You'll go to a different gas station. As long as we're narrowly defining the market, you have other choices. You have very elastic demand in that case. If we broadly define the market and we say all gasoline, right? So we're not talking about a specific type of gasoline. We're talking about all gasoline. The price has changed. Now you're much more inelastic because gasoline is a necessity. You don't have substitutes for it now if we're talking about all gas changing prices, and so you have much more inelastic demand. The picture here is of a television. So if we said Samsung TVs increased in price, then you're going to have much more elastic demand because you'll go buy an LG TV, right? You go buy a different type of TV. Where if we said all TVs increased in price, your demand is not going to change as much. You'll have much more inelastic demand when it's the more broadly defined market that is changing. And then number 5, and we talked about this with the opening example, is your time and adjustment process. How long are we talking about for this price change? Is it a really long-term price change? And if so, if you give me 10 years, I have more time to adjust my behavior. Over a long period of time, I'm going to be more elastic, right? So if the price of gas goes up 10%, today there's not much I can do about it. Today is the short-term time horizon. I can't change my behavior very much today because I got to get to work. So I'm going to buy it anyway. Very inelastic if we're talking just a price change today. But if we're talking about a price change that stays consistently high for a while, 10 years, now I can change my behavior more. Now I have more elastic demand. You give me more time, I can adjust, and I am more likely to adjust my behavior with a longer time period. So that is an introduction to price elasticity of demand. In future videos, we'll discuss more on this, and we'll talk about how to calculate it, and then we'll talk about some other types of demand.